April 8, 1943, 27,000 feet above Caen, France. The sky was calm, cold, thin, the kind of silence that only exists when you're suspended between worlds. Below, the war raged across fields, villages, and rail lines. Above, the light was clean, almost sterile. Inside the cockpit of his Messerschmitt Bf 109, Oberleutnant Karl-Heinz Jäger adjusted his oxygen sweep mask across a quiet sector. A routine patrol. His gloved hand rested on the stick with the ease of experience. Dozens of sorties, dozens of kills. He wasn't a boy anymore. He didn't need adrenaline to stay sharp. He had seen Stalingrad from the air, watched cities turn to smoke, and flown through storms of flak that erased squadrons in seconds. But this was different. This was Western France. The air was smooth, and yet, something felt off. There was a sound, distant, low, not the whine of a Merlin engine or the dry cough of a radial on its last breath. This was deeper, fuller, almost like thunder echoing in a tunnel. He scanned the sky again, but the clouds to his left remained undisturbed. Nothing was breaking through, no contrails, no flashes, just sound. He squinted, thinking perhaps it was engine noise bouncing off a weather front, but it was growing, slowly, consistently, like a tide pushing forward with mechanical inevitability. He didn't realize it yet, but that sound wasn't turbulence. It wasn't the atmosphere playing tricks. It was the voice of a machine born not in the fires of old Europe, but in the heart of American industry. Karl-Heinz shifted in his seat. Still no visual contact, but his instincts began to prick. In the East, you learn to trust that feeling, the one that creeps in just before the first flash, the one that tells you when something isn't right. He tapped his fuel gauge, checked his 6. Nothing. Empty sky. Still, that sound, now layered with a faint vibration through the airframe. He clicked the comms. Stürmer 2, do you hear that? Negative lead. What am I listening for? Something low, rhythmic. I can't explain it. Silence. Then laughter. Too much time in the clouds, Herr Oberleutnant. Karl-Heinz didn't respond. He just stared into the cloud bank. His breath slowed. His eyes narrowed. A memory surfaced. Something his instructor once said during his first months in flight school. Arriving. Not in waves. When you hear thunder above the clouds, but in quiet, mechanical whispers. At this stage in the war, the Luftwaffe still ruled the skies over occupied France. Their aces were experienced, well-trained, and surrounded by the aura of invincibility. And yet that aura was cracking, imperceptibly at first, but not with unfamiliar noises coming from places no sound should come from. That day, above Caen, what Karl-Heinz heard was the arrival of a new kind of war, a war not fought by tradition, nor by elite squadrons guided by doctrine and pride. This war was shaped by conveyor belts, standardized parts, and a philosophy that believed machines, when multiplied, could outweigh genius. And behind that philosophy was a plane. It did not turn sharper than a Focke-Wulf. It did not climb faster than a Bf 109. It was massive, heavy, and ugly to many, but it carried a voice, a deep, rolling thunder that grew louder the closer it came. And once you heard it, it was already too late. The P47 Thunderbolt had entered the European theater, not with a scream, but with a growl, a vibration that lived just beneath the skin of every engagement. Most Luftwaffe pilots didn't notice it at first. They dismissed the sound as coincidence. Some claimed it was just a slow American bomber climbing too high. Others never lived long enough to describe it. But a pattern began to emerge. The sky changed. The rhythm of missions shifted. New formations, new tactics, and always that low hum in the distance. Some pilots even joked about it in their bunkers. If the clouds growl, go home. But it wasn't a joke. It was a warning. Because beneath that thunder, there wasn't just aluminum and oil. There was a message. The era of the elite duel was ending, and in its place, the industrial storm had begun to gather. If you're already feeling the chill of that sky, imagine what it was like to sit in that cockpit and hear a sound you couldn't see coming. Let us know in the comments what moment in history gave you goosebumps like this. And if you're not already, subscribe to stay inside the cockpit with us, where war meets memory and memory becomes history. They laughed. That was the first reaction most Luftwaffe pilots had when they saw the P47 Thunderbolt. Too big, too slow, too fat to be taken seriously. It looked more like a flying oil drum than a fighter. The Germans, known for their engineering precision and elegance in design, couldn't help but mock the bulky silhouette of the new American aircraft. In Luftwaffe briefings, pilots joked that the Americans had finally found a way to fly a barn. Others nicknamed it the flying milk bottle, comparing its bloated fuselage to a glass jug bouncing awkwardly through the air. But behind the jokes was something deeper, a cultural arrogance forged through years of early victories, and a belief in technological and tactical superiority. Since 1939, German pilots had flown the finest aircraft Europe had to offer. The Bf-109 had dominated the skies over Poland, France, and the Low Countries. The Focke-Wulf 190, introduced in 1941, shocked the RAF with its power and agility. Luftwaffe aces like Adolf Galland, Günter Rall, and Erich Hartmann had already stacked dozens, some even hundreds, of kills. They weren't afraid of anything America could throw at them. To them, the United States was a nation of amateurs. Wealthy, yes. Resourceful, maybe, but not forged in fire. American pilots were seen as soft, untested, and dependent on numbers instead of skill. In mess halls and bunkers across occupied France, Luftwaffe veterans scoffed at the idea that the Yankees could match the discipline and instinct of a German-trained aviator. And for a while, it seemed they were right. When the Thunderbolt first entered service in 1943, its flaws were obvious. It was sluggish at low altitude, burned fuel at an alarming rate, and had a long takeoff roll that made ground crews nervous. During early escort missions, P-47s struggled to keep up with the bombers they were supposed to protect. American pilots, many of them new to combat, made clumsy mistakes. They broke formation too soon. They chased decoys into flak zones. They fought turning battles against lighter German fighters and paid the price. Reports from the Luftwaffe described it as easy prey. One German pilot, in a post-mission debriefing, reportedly said, "They come in tight formation, then scatter like frightened birds. You only have to pick one." In those early months, the P-47's reputation matched its shape. Heavy, awkward, ineffective. The Germans mocked not just the aircraft, but the pilots themselves. Stories circulated of American flyers bailing out at the first sign of trouble, or missing their targets by miles. But hidden inside the arrogance was a blind spot, because while German pilots laughed at the design, they rarely considered its purpose. The Thunderbolt wasn't built to be graceful. It wasn't designed for elegant dogfights over green countryside. It was created for a different kind of war. A war not of duels, but of production. A war where surviving to fly another day mattered more than style. And that is where the joke began to crack. The same German pilots who mocked the P-47 for being slow began to notice something strange. They would score perfect hits, several 20mm shells into the fuselage, and yet the aircraft would keep flying. Others swore they watched Thunderbolts vanish into clouds after being hit, only to reappear minutes later still fighting. In one engagement, a formation of FW-190s engaged a group of Thunderbolts near Rouen. The Germans outnumbered the Americans 2-1. The sky was theirs. And yet, after a chaotic 10 minutes of diving and rolling, only one German returned. The rest had been shot down by the very aircraft they all had once called flying tractors. The myth of invincibility began to crumble, and still the Americans kept coming. Even as the Luftwaffe adjusted tactics, changing altitude and formation to better engage the Thunderbolts, losses mounted. What they didn't yet understand was that they were no longer fighting individuals. They were fighting a system, a factory-powered system that built pilots faster than the Germans could kill them. The Luftwaffe came not from a battle, but from a report. A squadron leader writing to high command noted, "The new American fighters lack elegance but resist damage in ways we cannot explain. Our shells do not stop them. They appear in greater numbers each week. If this trend continues, we will not be able to hold the skies." That statement, buried in the files of the Reich Air Ministry, marked the first documented moment when the fear behind the laughter began to surface. For a force that had built its identity on precision, skill, and honor in aerial combat, it was deeply unsettling to face an enemy that seemed to value none of those things, and yet kept winning. Because the truth, slowly dawning on even the most seasoned German ace, was that the Americans weren't trying to win by playing the same game. They had changed the rules, and the P-47, that lumbering jug with 8 machine guns and a heart of steel, was the first proof that a new kind of warfare had arrived in Europe. Have you ever underestimated something? only to realize too late what you were really facing. Share your story in the comments. And if you're drawn to untold truths of history, be sure to join our mission by subscribing. This is where facts take flight. It was never meant to be beautiful. When Republic Aviation began designing what would become the P47 Thunderbolt, elegance was never on the table. This wasn't a plane made to impress with curves or dazzle with agility. It was built with one word in mind: survive. From nose to tail, the Thunderbolt looked like a contradiction to everything people thought they knew about fighter planes. At over 7 tons fully loaded, it was one of the heaviest single-engine fighters of the war. It stood tall on its gear, with a broad fuselage and thick wings that seemed almost too bulky for flight. In an age where slim silhouettes and sleek designs ruled the skies, the P-47 looked like a flying anvil. But hidden beneath that industrial skin was an engine that changed everything. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, a 2-row 18-cylinder radial engine capable of producing over 2,000 horsepower. When paired with a 2-stage turbo supercharger, the Thunderbolt could climb to altitudes over 40,000 feet and still breathe like it was flying at sea level. That engine gave the P-47 something few planes of the era had: the power not just to fly, but to fight on its own terms. American pilots often describe the experience of opening the throttle on a Thunderbolt as unleashing a beast. The entire aircraft shook, not in fear or weakness, but with the raw violence of power looking for direction. On the ground, mechanics had to wear ear protection just to be near it during startup. In the air, that same rumble became part of the plane's legend, a sound German pilots would come to associate with danger. The plane's 8 Browning 50 caliber machine guns were mounted 4 on each wing, each gun capable of firing between 750 and 850 rounds per minute. When fired together, they released a combined storm of metal, over 100 rounds per second. Pilots described the vibration as something primal. One said it felt like flying while holding onto a jackhammer. And it wasn't just firepower. The P-47 was built like a tank. Its air-cooled radial engine could take hits that would destroy a liquid-cooled engine. Its thick armor plating protected the pilot from shrapnel, cannon fire, and even exploding fuel tanks. In training, a running joke among ground crews was that the plane was more likely to crush what it landed on than be destroyed itself. One pilot, after being hit by ground fire over France, returned to base with an elevator sheared off, his canopy missing, and one landing gear jammed. He landed anyway. After climbing out, covered in oil and sweat, he looked at the bullet holes and simply said, "This plane is not supposed to be flying. And yet here I am." Engineers at Republic knew exactly what they had made. They called it overbuilt. Every structural element of the P-47 was engineered with extra weight and strength, not for speed or elegance, but for endurance. This philosophy had roots in American industrial thinking. Unlike their Axis counterparts who often optimized machines for a specific role or refined beauty, American designers embraced modularity, mass production, and above all, durability. The Thunderbolt was not just a machine, it was an answer to the German Bf-109 and tight turns, an answer to the FW-190 with its aggressive roll rate and frontal attack capabilities, an answer to the question, what if a fighter was built not to dance, but to dominate through brute force? At full speed in a dive, the P-47 could exceed 500 miles per hour. German fighters that tried to follow it down often experienced compressibility, a phenomenon where controls locked up due to air pressure, sending planes into unrecoverable dives. The Thunderbolt, thanks to its rugged design, could survive these conditions better than most. In the Pacific, a similar version of the same engine would later power the F-4U Corsair. And decades after the war, engineers would credit the R2800 as one of the most reliable radial engines ever built. But in Europe, in 1943, it was the heart of a machine that was just beginning to reveal its true nature. This was not a fighter that won by flair. It won by showing up, absorbing punishment, and returning it in quantities the enemy couldn't match. And that's when the real shift began. Luftwaffe pilots who once laughed at its shape began to whisper about its stamina. Intelligence reports started noting the P-47's survivability. Radio intercepts picked up German squadrons warning each other about it. One commander wrote, "We can hit it, but we cannot stop it. It keeps coming back." This fear, slow and creeping, spread not because of stories, but because of repetition. The P-47 wasn't mythical. It was relentless. On cloudy mornings, ground crews would hear the roar of engines over the channel and know exactly what was coming. Not a formation of elegant aces, not a squad of daring duelists, but a fleet of machines, forged in factories, flown by men trained to operate, not perform. That difference mattered, because by now, the war was shifting from artistry to scale, and no plane better represented that shift than the Thunderbolt. Have you ever seen strength misjudged as weakness? Leave your thoughts below. And if this kind of raw historical truth speaks to you, hit subscribe and ride with us through the skies where legends were forged not by looks, but by survival. In war, mistakes cost lives, and in early 1943, the skies over Western Europe became a harsh classroom for American pilots flying the P-47 Thunderbolt for the first time. They had the machines, they had the fuel, they had the numbers, but they didn't yet know how to fight. When the first squadrons of P-47s were deployed to the European theater, optimism was high. American engineers had built a fighter that was faster in a dive, tougher under fire, and better armed than anything the Luftwaffe had seen in large numbers. But war is not won on paper, and no matter how advanced the machine, victory depends on how it is used. The initial missions were brutal. Thunderbolts were assigned to escort bombing raids over occupied France and Germany, protecting B-17 flying fortresses on their long flights to industrial targets. But no one had truly tested the Thunderbolt's capabilities in hostile skies. American pilots, many of them barely out of training, flew tight formations across the channel with confidence but little experience. They were taught to stay with the bombers, to engage only when necessary and to avoid aggressive dogfights. But that's not how war works when the enemy writes the rules. Luftwaffe pilots had been fighting since 1939. They had refined ambush tactics, used the weather to their advantage, and understood exactly when and where to strike. The Focke-Wulf 190s and Bf-109s would dive out of the sun, or rise from below the bomber stream, hit fast and vanish before the Thunderbolts could respond. In those first months, dozens of P-47s never returned. American bombers were torn apart by cannon fire, and the escorts could not keep up. The P-47's range was limited. Without external fuel tanks, it could not reach deep into Germany. Pilots would turn for home just as the bombers reached their targets. A vulnerability the Luftwaffe exploited ruthlessly. German interceptors learned to wait. They let the Thunderbolts escort the formations for as long as they could. Then, as the fighters peeled away to return to England, the real attack would begin. B-17s flying alone were easy prey. Back in the debrief rooms, frustration boiled over. Pilots blamed equipment. Commanders blamed training. Mechanics blamed doctrine. Something was wrong. And fight like they were flying exactly what. Tight loops, rolling some scissors, American pilots tried. It was suicide. The Thunderbolt was never meant to dogfight in circles. It was too heavy, too slow in tight turns. Those who tried to outmaneuver German fighters often found themselves out of airspeed, out of altitude, and out of time. One pilot, Lieutenant Mark Weiss, wrote in his journal after barely surviving a dogfight. Near Lille, I tried to match his turn. He tightened, I stalled. My wing dipped and I fell like a brick. He disappeared. I think he let me go. It was a humbling realization. The plane was strong, fast in a dive, and terrifying when attacking. But it was not nimble. It was not elegant. It was not made to dance. And yet, within those painful lessons, something began to shift. To experiment, squadron leaders flew at higher altitudes. They used the P-47's dive speed to make hit-and-run attacks. They stopped trying to dogfight and started playing to the plane's strengths. The Thunderbolt was a machine built to punish, not to perform. Commanders encouraged aggressive vertical tactics. Dive from altitude, fire a burst, and climb away before the enemy could react. Strike fast, hit hard, never linger. They called it boom and zoom. But before that transformation took hold, the price was high. Losses mounted. Each mission taught a new lesson in blood and steel. At the same time, logistics and engineering teams back in England were working around the clock. Drop tanks were introduced. External fuel pods mounted under the wings. With them, the Thunderbolt's range extended dramatically. Now it could stay with the bombers longer, even reach targets deep in German territory. And pilots began to talk. Stories circulated of planes returning with massive damage. One P-47 came home with part of its wing missing. Another landed on one wheel after a gear failure. Crews took photos of bullet holes, cracked canopies, shattered control surfaces, and yet, the plane survived. Morale shifted, slowly, subtly. What was once a source of frustration became a point of pride. The Thunderbolt would not win with finesse, but it would not be beaten easily. And with each mission, each mistake, each return from what should have been a final flight, American pilots were learning not just how to fly the P-47, but how to fight with it, because sometimes in war, the first battles are not against the enemy, but against your own assumptions. Have you ever had to unlearn something just to move forward? Share your moment of hard-earned clarity in the comments. And if you're finding meaning in the grit behind these stories, hit that subscribe button and come with us deeper into the skies where strategy was forged from failure. It was supposed to be his last mission. Second Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson had flown more than his share of sorties by mid-1943. He was part of the 56th Fighter Group, one of the first American units to operate the P-47 Thunderbolt in Europe. By that summer, Johnson had already begun to understand what his aircraft could endure, but nothing could have prepared him for what happened on June 26th. The mission was a bomber escort deep into occupied France. The air was thick with tension. German interceptors had grown bolder. American bombers were getting hit harder and sooner. Johnson's squadron was assigned to patrol above and around the B-17 formations, scanning for threats. The flight began like any other. Clear takeoff, tight formation, radios buzzing with steady check-ins. But above the clouds, everything changes fast. German Focke-Wulf 190s appeared like ghosts, precise, brutal. A swirling dogfight broke out and the sky disintegrated into chaos. Tracers lit the air. Explosions folded wings mid-flight. Pilots yelled through radios, giving warnings that came too late. Johnson got hit. A 20mm cannon shell exploded near his engine cowling. Shrapnel slashed through the fuselage. Smoke poured into the cockpit. His canopy was jammed. Instruments failed. His hands gripped the stick harder than they ever had. The edges of the firewall. He tried to bail out. He pulled and kicked and cursed, but the jammed canopy refused to budge. Trapped inside a dying plane, Johnson made a decision that only someone in a Thunderbolt could make. He kept flying, wounded, disoriented, vision blurred from oil and smoke. He leveled out and began the impossible, flying home in a wreck that should not be flying at all. But that wasn't the end of it. As Johnson limped toward England, alone, damaged and vulnerable, a lone FW-190 spotted him. The German pilot approached from behind, likely seeing an easy kill. A smoking, wounded Thunderbolt drifting through the sky like a floating coffin. The German pulled in close. Johnson could see the pilot's face. He braced for the final burst. But instead of firing a short, lethal volley, the FW-190 pilot pulled alongside, inspecting the damage. The Thunderbolt was shredded, holes across the wings, stabilizer nearly gone, the rudder torn. It was a miracle the aircraft was still airborne. The German moved into firing position, and then he opened fire. Rounds raked the Thunderbolt's fuselage. Johnson felt the impacts shake the aircraft, but it did not go down. Tried again. The FW-190 pulled back. The P-47 coughed, but refused to die. Johnson fought the controls, staying level through sheer force of will. And the German tried a third time. Still nothing. Then something remarkable happened. The enemy pilot flew up beside Johnson, leveled his wings, and slowly peeled away. The message was clear. I cannot kill you. And maybe, I respect that. When he landed, Johnson made it back to England. His aircraft had over 200 holes in it. A hydraulic system destroyed. No canopy. Half a stabilizer. One wheel. And yet it landed. That story spread fast. Not just through the 56th Fighter Group, but across airfields, briefing rooms, and even enemy lines. Because this was not just about Robert Johnson. It was about the P-47. German pilots began to whisper about it would not fall. The aircraft that absorbed entire magazines and kept flying. Intelligence reports noted the increasing number of Thunderbolts returning from missions with what should have been fatal damage. Johnson's story became legend, but he was not alone. Over time, more pilots shared similar experiences. One Thunderbolt landed with its entire tail control severed, the pilot guiding it down using only engine power and instinct. Another flew back with an elevator shot clean off. Another returned after a belly landing on a bomb-cratered runway, its tires blown, fuel lines leaking, the pilot bruised and bloodied, but alive. These weren't stories. They were testimonies. The P-47 was proving something few fighters in history ever had. It was not just a weapon. It was a shield, a lifeline, a partner in survival. And that changed everything. Ridicule had now shifted into something else entirely. Not fear, not yet, but recognition. The Luftwaffe no longer dismissed the Thunderbolt. They studied it. They adjusted tactics to avoid head-on exchanges. They warned new pilots never to assume a damaged P-47 was out of the fight, because sometimes it wasn't. Sometimes it was just catching its breath. If this story of resilience left you speechless, let us know what part hit you the hardest in the comments. And if you believe in honoring the machines and people that defied the odds, consider subscribing, because history like this deserves to be remembered exactly as it happened. It started with altitude, not just climbing higher, but thinking higher. By late 1943, American pilots had stopped trying to turn like their German counterparts. The Luftwaffe had built its doctrine around dogfighting, tight spirals, sudden rolls, quick reversals. And in that game, the Messerschmitt Bf 109 and the Focke-Wulf 190 excelled. But the P-47 Thunderbolt was not made for that game. It was made to break it. Once the Americans learned to stop mimicking their enemy, the war in the air began to shift. Pilots started to exploit what the Thunderbolt did better than any other single-engine fighter of the time. It could dive, really dive. The P-47 could enter, a steep nose-down descent from high altitude, and reach speeds over 500 miles per hour. Its rugged frame could absorb the pressure. Its thick wings remained stable where others shuddered and buckled. German fighters that tried to follow often lost control due to compressibility, a dangerous aerodynamic effect that turned speed into a death sentence. And when the Thunderbolt dove, it didn't come down like a plane. It came down like a falling sledgehammer. Boom and zoom. That was the tactic. Drop fast from altitude, fire a short burst, then use the engine's power to climb back out before the enemy could react. The P-47's 850 caliber machine guns could shred a plane in seconds. A single pass was often enough. There was no dancing, no circling, just the hammer and the climb. The strategy was not only effective, it was psychological. German pilots began to describe engagements where they never saw the enemy approach. 1 second, they were flying a straight path. The next, their wingman exploded in a hail of gunfire from above. And by the time they could react, the Thunderbolt was already gone, climbing back into the clouds like a ghost made of steel and smoke. This hit and vanish method allowed the Americans to avoid drawn-out engagements. It also gave them the advantage of energy, the combination of speed and altitude, which they now understood was their greatest asset. Training manuals were rewritten. Flight instructors began emphasizing vertical movement over horizontal duels. Pilots were told to fly smart, not showy, and more importantly, to let the Thunderbolt do what it was born to do. One pilot, Captain Francis Gabreski, became a legend using these very tactics. He recorded 28 victories in Europe, many of them earned through precision strikes from above. Gabreski would later say, "If you fought in a P-47 like it was a P-51 or a Spitfire, you would lose. But if you used it like a hammer from heaven, you would win." The results were undeniable. Luftwaffe formations that once welcomed combat now hesitated. They started flying with more caution. German squadron leaders warned young pilots to break off the moment a P-47 appeared above them. In some cases, they simply turned away, refusing to engage unless absolutely necessary. The sky had changed. What was once a two-dimensional battlefield had become three-dimensional. Altitude was no longer a place of safety. It was where the enemy waited, hidden, patient, watching. And the Thunderbolt was no longer the clumsy outsider. It was the predator. To make matters worse for the Luftwaffe, American bomber formations were now supported more effectively. The Thunderbolt's range had been extended with drop tanks. Pilots could stay with the bombers longer and engage deeper into enemy territory. The Luftwaffe found itself forced to fight not just for kills, but for survival. There are stories from the German side, stories of Thunderbolts coming out of the sun with no warning, of pilots blacking out from the sheer force of trying to escape a dive, of entire squadrons being caught unaware and decimated in a single pass. In one engagement over the Ardennes, a German fighter wing was escorting Stuka dive bombers when they were attacked from 25,000 feet. The first wave of Thunderbolts dropped like missiles. The German formation broke apart in seconds. Some never fired a shot. The P-47 didn't need finesse. It needed speed, altitude, and timing. And now, it had all three. The roar of its engine at full throttle during a dive became something more than just mechanical. It was a sound that announced destruction. Pilots who heard it once never forgot it. Many began to avoid clouds entirely. Visibility became sacred. The sky, once a playground for daring pilots, had become a place of hidden dangers, because somewhere above those clouds, a thunderbolt might be waiting. And it did not warn. It struck. War is often won not just by force, but by fear, by making the enemy doubt, hesitate, flinch. The P-47 had done that. It had taken a role that was once dismissed as inadequate and reshaped it through brute function and evolving strategy. From a misunderstood behemoth to the undisputed king of altitude strikes, it changed the rhythm of the war. Let us know in the comments if you've ever seen strength underestimated, only to rise when it mattered most. And if stories like this stir something in you, subscribe and help us keep these memories alive, where every sound has a meaning, and every climb carries a purpose. It was not courage that turned the tide. It was volume. By 1944, the war in the skies over Europe had shifted from a contest of individual brilliance to a demonstration of industrial will. The Luftwaffe, once feared and dominant, was bleeding, not from a single blow but from 1,000 cuts. And many of those cuts came from the production lines back in the United States. At peak wartime output, American factories were producing one P-47 Thunderbolt every 55 minutes. Let that settle. Not one per day, one per hour, day and night, around the clock. Engines were tested as others were being installed. Paint was drying on one wing while rivets were being driven into another. While German engineers debated modifications and fought supply shortages, American manufacturers refined the process until it ran with machine-like precision. They built Thunderbolts not as aircraft, but as a product. Repeatable, scalable, replaceable. Each factory worker in New Jersey or Indiana or Illinois became an extension of the pilot in the cockpit. They may never have seen the clouds of France or the smoke over Berlin, but they were there, in every bolt, in every bullet, in every roar of the double wasp engine. Germany, meanwhile, was unraveling. Fuel was running scarce. Low. Replacement parts were harder to come by. And worst of all, experienced pilots were dying faster than they could be replaced. In 1942, Germany trained hundreds of new pilots every month. By 1944, those numbers had plummeted. Flight schools were rushed. Cockpits were filled with teenagers. Many were given only basic flight instruction before being sent into combat. Some had never fired a live round before their first dogfight, and what they faced was no longer just a plane. It was an air force of machines that refused to die. P-47 squadrons became more aggressive with each passing month. The pilots knew reinforcements would arrive. That damaged aircraft would be replaced. That fuel and ammunition were never in doubt. Luftwaffe ground crews began reporting a shift in American behavior. Thunderbolts were flying deeper into German airspace. They stayed longer. They attacked with greater confidence, and always in numbers that seemed impossible. One German officer, writing to high command in 1944, described it as fighting a storm that never ends. He was not wrong. When a German pilot was shot down, the loss echoed. His experience, his training, his aircraft, all gone. When an American pilot was lost, his replacement was already on the boat, his plane already in production, his gear already boxed and shipped. This imbalance was not just logistical, it was psychological. Veteran German aces began to sense the change. The air war was no longer a matter of who was better, but of who could last longer, and the answer became clearer with each sunrise. Entire squadrons of Thunderbolts would launch from England before dawn. By mid-morning, they were striking rail hubs in Belgium. By afternoon, they were strafing airfields in Holland. And before sunset, they were back over the channel, fueled and ready for tomorrow. The Luftwaffe, stretched thin, could not be everywhere. Radar operators reported contact after contact until the screens became noise. Scramble orders were issued only to be canceled minutes later. By the time interceptors were in the air, the Thunderbolts were gone or had already finished their work. It was warfare by saturation. Even when Germans managed to shoot down one or two attackers, the rest remained, and more would come the next day, and the next. This is how the Luftwaffe began to die. Not with a dramatic final battle, but with exhaustion. The Thunderbolt's durability became a metaphor for the force behind it. America was not fighting with finesse. It was fighting with factories, with conveyor belts, with welding torches and ration stamps and men and women who never wore a uniform but built 1,000 hammers of war. And that hammer came down relentlessly. German airfields that once buzzed with disciplined preparation became chaotic. Spare parts were scavenged from wrecks. Fuel tanks were patched with rubber from destroyed trucks. Old training aircraft were pressed into frontline duty. At the same time, P-47s were being modified and improved with every new batch. Faster engines, better sights, more range. The gap widened with each iteration, and pilots noticed. One Luftwaffe ace, after being forced down and captured, told his interrogators, "You can destroy one, maybe two, but 10 more." And their pilots do not hesitate, and they are all the same. That was the new reality. It was not a duel. It was a campaign of attrition. The Germans had skill. The Americans had scale. And in a war that had become a numbers game, scale was everything. It is easy to glorify the few. The lone ace, the sharpshooter, the brave underdog. But sometimes, history is written not by the rare, but by the repeated. And the P-47 was. If you felt the weight of those numbers, the cold logic behind the thunder, let us know your thoughts in the comments. And if this kind of perspective helps bring clarity to the chaos of war, we invite you to subscribe and help us continue telling these stories. One flight, one mission, one factory at a time. It began as a fighter, a tool of air superiority, a shield for bombers crossing hostile skies. But by 1944, the P-47 Thunderbolt had evolved far beyond the narrow label of escort. It had become something else entirely. It had become a hammer. As the Allied forces pushed across Europe, the battlefield began to change shape. Cities were no longer just targets. They were fortresses. Roads became arteries of enemy movement. Bridges, fuel depots, train stations, all critical, all fragile. And the Allies needed something that could not only fly above the battle, but reach into it. The Thunderbolt answered that call. With its rugged frame, incredible payload capacity, and nearly unmatched survivability, the P-47 became a natural choice for the close air support role. It could carry up to 2,500 pounds of ordnance, including high-explosive bombs, fragmentation bombs, even rockets, napalm, and when configured for attack runs, it looked less like a fighter and more like a flying artillery battery. On the ground, soldiers began to refer to them by a new nickname, not milk jugs, not flying bricks, but jugs of fire. In the months leading up to D-Day, the P-47 was used to systematically dismantle the German logistical network in France. Thunderbolts roared across the countryside at low altitude, blasting rail yards, ripping apart supply convoys, and obliterating communication hubs. French farmers and villagers would later recall the terrifying sound of those attack runs. A deep mechanical growl followed by the violent percussion of bombs hitting the earth. Buildings shook, roads disappeared, and above it all, a single aircraft, often flying alone, banking away at treetop level, engines screaming. The psychological effect was immense. German troops began referring to the Thunderbolt as the Stone Crusher, the machine that came from nowhere and left only dust. What made the P-47 so effective in this role was not just its firepower, but its toughness. It could take damage from small arms, flak, even near misses from enemy shells, and still return to base. Pilots pushed the aircraft to the limit, flying into narrow valleys, and dropping their payloads from altitudes so low that shrapnel sometimes punctured their own wings. One pilot, Lieutenant Harold E. Moore, recalled a mission where he struck a German tank column in the Ardennes. He flew through a curtain of 20mm flak, released two 500-pound bombs, and watched them detonate under a Panther. The shockwave flipped his aircraft upward. Instruments went dark, but the plane held. He limped back to base with over 80 holes in his fuselage. When he landed, he reportedly said, "It felt like the world was ending, but she held together." Stories like his were no longer rare. The Thunderbolt became so feared by enemy ground units that entire convoys would abandon their vehicles and scatter at the sound of approaching engines. Trucks were driven off roads into ditches. Tanks halted beneath tree lines. German soldiers began painting decoy vehicles to draw away the attacks. But it rarely worked. The P-47's pilots were trained to identify camouflage. They knew the color of German fuel trucks, the profile of artillery batteries, the smoke trail of a mobile launch platform, and when they found them, they did not hesitate. In the weeks after the Normandy landings, Thunderbolts flew thousands of sorties in support of Allied troops. They attacked bridges behind enemy lines to delay reinforcements. They struck retreating columns, often so precisely that ground units would mark their targets with smoke or flares. The communication between air and ground improved with each mission. British and American forward air controllers relayed positions in real time. Some units even installed radio sets in tanks, allowing them to call in Thunderbolt strikes directly from the battlefield. It was this coordination that turned the P-47 from a weapon into a system, and the results were devastating. German generals began to report severe disruption to their supply lines. Fuel shortages became catastrophic. Entire divisions were cut off and left to retreat or surrender. One captured officer told his interrogators, "We could not move by day. Your aircraft see everything." The Thunderbolt had become more than a fighter. It was now a force of denial, denying mobility, denying reinforcement, denying escape. And all of this was done at scale. One squadron of P-47s could destroy dozens of vehicles in a single day. Multiply that by dozens of squadrons, flying sorties across France, Belgium, and Germany, and the result was a battlefield transformed. By early 1945, the Luftwaffe was no longer the primary concern of many P-47 pilots. They were hunting the veins of the German war machine. Trains, fuel depots, communications towers. They followed the lifeblood of the Reich and choked it off. In a report to the Supreme Allied Command, General Eisenhower praised the tactical air forces, noting that their strikes had crippled the enemy's capacity to resist long before the ground forces arrived. The P-47 was the muscle behind that strategy. It had started as a heavy, underdog, underestimated fighter mocked by its enemies. But through adaptation and raw resilience, it had become the sword and the shield of the Allied push into occupied Europe. This was no longer just a machine. It was an extension of Allied resolve. Have you ever seen something evolve into its fullest potential under pressure? Share your reflections in the comments. And if you value the untold sides of history, consider subscribing. So these voices, human and mechanical, are never lost in time. By the spring of 1945, the skies above Germany had changed forever. What was once the domain of the Luftwaffe, ruled by proud aces, tight formations, and clinical tactics, had become a silent graveyard of twisted aluminum and fading hope. The confidence that had once filled the cockpits of German pilots had vanished. What remained was a shadow, a memory of what had been, and looming in that silence was the unmistakable sound of thunder. But it wasn't the weather. It was the unmistakable growl of the P-47 Thunderbolt. The aircraft that had once been laughed at was now feared. Its silhouette no longer inspired mockery. It inspired retreat. And for many German pilots, it was no longer just a threat. It was an omen. There are countless accounts from the closing months of the war that speak not of triumph but of exhaustion. Luftwaffe squadrons were scrambled with half-trained pilots in patched-together aircraft. Fuel was rationed. Spare parts were cannibalized from wreckage. Some pilots took off knowing there would be no return. And above them, the sky belonged to the jugs. Thunderbolts flew in numbers. They prowled the skies like wolves in formation, watching for movement below, waiting for targets. The German flak gunners, once so confident, had come to call them the Grey Ghosts, machines that came through fire and smoke and simply kept going. In towns across Germany, civilians learned to recognize the sound of the P-47's radial engine. It meant something was coming. A column destroyed, a train halted, a depot erased. The sound of thunder no longer marked nature's fury, it marked America's. And in those final months, that sound meant the end. By April, the Luftwaffe was no longer a force. It was a memory held together by desperation. Pilots who once boasted of 20, 30, even 100 kills, now spoke in whispers about how many of their friends they had lost. They saw the pattern, the endless waves, the unstoppable engine of war that the Allies had become. Because the Thunderbolt wasn't just an aircraft, it was a message. It was proof that this war would not be won by glory, not by aces, not by maneuver, but by resilience, by industry, by the will to outlast and overwhelm. There is a haunting quote from a captured German officer in May of 1945. When asked what changed in the air war, he answered simply, We stopped laughing. The P-47 had fulfilled its purpose. It had escorted bombers across enemy skies. It had hunted fighters in the upper altitudes. It had shattered railways, destroyed convoys, supported infantry, and silenced artillery. It had done everything asked of it, and more. And it had done it without ever asking to be admired. Because the Thunderbolt wasn't a work of art. It was a tool, a weapon of function, a flying embodiment of determination, in the hands of men who learned to trust it, and through the labor of those who built it, the P-47 helped turn the tide of a world at war. It didn't just survive. It didn't just fight. It endured. When the war ended, many Thunderbolts were scrapped. Others were sold or stored away. The factories stopped. The noise quieted. But in the minds of those who lived through those years, one sound remains. Not a scream, not a whistle. Thunder, mechanical, deliberate, and undeniable. To everyone who stood beside us on this journey through history, we want to thank you for listening, for remembering, for feeling the weight of what these stories carry. If this final chapter left you with a deeper sense of respect for the machines, the people, and the cost, let us know in the comments. And if you want to continue exploring the forgotten corners of World War II, we invite you to click the next video that's about to appear on your screen. Because history is not just written in books. Sometimes, it echoes through the sky.